Following extensive deliberation, Denmark has introduced a law that criminalises the burning, soiling, trampling or cutting of recognised religious scriptures, such as the Quran, the Bible or the Torah. This legislative move comes in response to incidents where Qurans were burned and damaged during protests in Denmark and Sweden after months of intense debate. So joining me now to discuss this is the editor of Spiked Online, Tom Slater. Tom, welcome to the show. Is it not the case that Denmark is now just effectively reintroducing blasphemy law?
It is, and it's particularly tragic given the fact they only repealed their blasphemy law in like 2017.
Right.
So there's not been a very big window.
So you had a few years of freedom and then it's all gone.
Of course, it was one of those things where, that old law hadn't been enforced for a very long time. This one definitely is going to be, because it is in response to, as you say, there has been this spate of Quran burnings which have been taking place not just in Denmark but also in Sweden. And as a consequence of that, they've been met with a furious response, terror threat level rising, and also essentially diplomatic dressing down from various Muslim majority countries who have said in no uncertain terms you need to clamp down on these people. One thing that I thought was very telling was one of the spokespeople for the Moderate Party, which is part of the coalition in Denmark there, said that we are introducing this law not out of desire but out of necessity.
Well, they couched it as a safety measure.
And that says it all, I think. They've
said this is to do with we're putting Danish people at risk, at harm, either at home or abroad. Aren't they effectively saying that the Islamic world is uniquely combustible, and that isn't this quite patronising to Muslims?
It is, and I think it's also profoundly misguided insofar as there is this idea that censorship is the way that you tamp down on violence, it's the way that you avoid trouble. It's completely the opposite.
Yes.
If you suggest that if you menace a nation or a group of people for saying a particular thing that you happen to find offensive, or doing a particular thing that you happen to find blasphemous or sacrilegious, you're effectively inviting anyone to threaten violence or to inflict violence and expect a response, to expect a capitulation. So I think this could really backfire.
Well, if they're explicitly saying that they're worried about violent repercussions, doesn't that mean that terrorism works? Because they've just passed a law along those lines.
No, exactly. It works if you give in to it, and that's precisely what they're doing. And whilst I understand the pressure that they're under, you saw the Danish authorities talk about the terror threat level. And of course, it wasn't that long ago, it was only a few weeks ago, that we saw that terror attack in Brussels, which is specifically targeted, according to the video by the Islamist extremists, Swedish football fans, because of the Quran burnings which have been going on in that country, seemingly as well. So it's not that the threat doesn't exist, it's just the fact that if you capitulate to it, first of all, you're not standing up for your own values and your own citizens and their rights. You're effectively allowing outsiders or domestic terrorists to dictate the freedoms of everyone else who lives in your society. But as I say, also, you're basically creating a kind of violent, intolerant veto, where if you menace someone, then they have to capitulate, and that's dreadful.
But the Danish government didn't make this mistake back in 2005, when there was the controversy over the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which were published in a Danish publication, Danish newspaper. There was a lot of pressure at the time to punish the publication, to censor that publication. There was a judicial review, but none of it worked. The government stood firm. So what's changed?
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes it so depressing, is the fact that you did have Denmark more or less kind of standing by Jyllands-Posten and the journalists there, not capitulating, as you say, in terms of kind of ushering laws that would stop this from happening. There was, as we've seen similarly in the UK and the US, a kind of talking out of both sides of their mouth from a lot of the kind of political establishment or like other cultural figures who were nervous about it and actually said that they shouldn't have done it and so on. But nevertheless, more or less stood firm. Now we see what's happened. I think across the West, we've seen a kind of failure of nerve. And it's particularly depressing because really ever since 1989 and the Fatwa against Salman Rushdie, there's been this attempt to globalise Islamic blasphemy laws on the part of Islamic majority countries, in some cases, as also just Islamist terrorist organisations.
Yes.
And it's been depressingly successful. First of all, because there was this tendency just to internalise these rules, to not go there when it comes to criticising religion. So you almost didn't need a law. Now you've got Denmark actually putting it in black and white statute.
Yes.
And that is a tremendously depressing milestone that I think we have to reckon with.
Don't we sort of have it here? I mean, there was that 14-year-old boy in West Yorkshire who dropped a Quran on the floor by mistake, scuffed the pages, and the police were he was reported to the police, suspended from school. So don't we have those blasphemy laws here in one way or another anyway?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, that was a particularly chilling case because on the one hand, you just had, again, the school punishing him and the police being brought in because of concerns about a kind of backlash. But then he was actually given, this boy in question, who was an autistic teenager, right? Didn't seem to really know he was doing anything with any malice, it seems like, if you listen to the testimonies. He was actually given a non-crime hate incident as a consequence of that. So what we're seeing,
by the police,
exactly.
And he received death threats.
He received death threats. His mother received death threats. And that's the thing. This isn't just about these Scandinavian countries which have a particular specific problem with a spate of Quran burnings and protests as a consequence of that. This is a problem across the West.
So it's slightly complicated, isn't it? Because I personally am very uncomfortable with the image of books being burnt. I don't like it as a form of protest. I think it has connotations of the Third Reich. I think it just has the kind of unpleasant feeling about it that I just think there are better ways to protest than this. But that said, if I buy a book, it's my book and I should be able to do what I want with it, right?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, just because we believe in freedom doesn't mean we always agree with how people express themselves.
Yeah.
That being said, these Quran burnings, there is also context to them. There have been a lot of far-right agitators who have been doing it for reasons of just trying to gin up trouble and to engineer some sort of response from Muslims because they've got a kind of bigoted agenda against them. But there's other people, for instance, a Danish Iranian artist who has been doing this as a kind of art project, particularly to protest against the Iranian regime, which she herself escaped. So that's obviously fundamentally different. And I think, again, it comes down to context, of course, and it also comes down to just having the freedom to do it, which I think is fundamental, even if we don't always agree with how people exercise that right.
But again, we are living in this climate of intimidation now. I mean, everyone stood up after the horrible Charlie Hebdo massacre and said, je suis Charlie. That lasted about a minute, didn't it? Because people don't draw those sorts of cartoons anymore. I think even Charlie Hebdo for a while stopped doing it. So the climate of fear is real. In this country, we had a film, The Lady of Heaven, a film made by a group of Muslim people, but they were the wrong aspect. They were Shia Muslims rather than Sunni Muslims. And that got shut down because there were mobs protesting. So we are living in that. Do we have to just accept the reality now that we don't really have freedom of speech when it comes to criticism and ridicule of this particular faith?
I definitely don't think we should accept it in the sense of allowing the state of affairs to continue for much longer. But you're exactly right in the fact that we've already arrived there. And I think it's so important that we realise that this isn't like a kind of neat, specific carve-out where freedom of speech is concerned. The struggle for freedom of speech was built on, in large part, the right to blaspheme, the right to mock gods and prophets. It's fundamental. It's not something which is just kind of a niche issue at the sidelines that we can just ignore and not really deal with. So I think if we give up that right, then we're essentially kind of selling the whole thing down the river.
But how do we do that when the threats are real? I mean, Samuel Paty, the school teacher in Paris, was beheaded on the street simply for showing the Charlie Hebdo cartoons in a lesson on free speech. The teacher at Batley Grammar School, I believe, is still in hiding after he showed those cartoons, again, in a lesson on free speech. I mean, it was relevant. It was part of the school curriculum, but the trade unions didn't defend that man. The head teacher didn't defend him, and he's having to go into hiding. None of us want that. So you can say to comedians, why aren't you mocking all of this stuff? But, none of us want death threats and that kind of thing. So on a practical basis, how can we do anything about this?
On a practical basis, I think, first of all, it's not as if everyone has some sort of obligation to engage in this form of blasphemy. But those who do want to do it should be defended to the hilt. That should be in terms of physically, if necessary, in terms of security and so on, but also in public life, in discussion. I mean, the Batley Grammar School was such a perfect example because when this teacher was menaced for showing those cartoons as part of a religious studies class on blasphemy, pretty relevant, you would think, the local MP essentially denounced him. The head teacher almost instantly capitulated, and everyone else just sort of stared at their shoelaces. So this is something which I think is really important that we do stand up for it.
Right.
Because at the moment, it's clear that the response is not a kind of robust defence of our liberal freedoms. It's been very thin on the ground in all of these instances.
And that is something we could all do. And I wonder whether we just didn't learn our lesson in the Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses affair, because at the time, one of our best writers being threatened with death by a foreign power, you would have thought we could all get behind that and say, actually, this is outrageous. You don't get to decide what this writer writes, that we would have supported Salman Rushdie. But we instead had endless debates about whether he brought it on himself. Yeah. And a lot of those were televised debates. Is it that we failed back then, and so we've missed our shot?
I think there's certainly some truth in that. I mean, people forget that even the Thatcher government at the time was very odd in their response to it. Obviously, they gave him police protection, which was nice of them, it's the least they could do. But also, they talked about how much they felt the hurt of the Muslim community, and they said that he's someone who's also offended British values, because he was quite a left-wing voice who would criticise a lot of elements of the British establishment. So I think from day one, we've failed to stick by these fundamental liberties, stick by the heretics and the blasphemers in question.
Yes.
But just because we haven't done it before doesn't mean we shouldn't start doing it now.
And a lot of Muslim people, I would say, the majority of Muslim people say that they are appalled by death threats and violence in response to even things they may find distasteful. So why do we insist on, basically capitulating to this minority of ultra-conservative reactionary types within that religious group.
I mean, I think it's a combination of things. There's certainly a huge amount of cowardice. I think one of the most chilling things that has happened in recent years is that people in politics or people in the media generally seem to think these people have a point when they say that you shouldn't be allowed to mock or criticise or depict certain religions and prophets or whatever. They seem to see it as almost kind of quasi-racist thing to do, which is absolutely bizarre. So in some respects, people have completely internalised the logic of the Ayatollah, as you might see it. But that's the more difficult thing to unwind. It's not just cowardice that's driving it. It's
no, it's not.
The sense that they've kind of got a point.
But we have a lot of, I mean, some Labour MPs have been pushing for more stringent laws against Islamophobia. But I'm not even sure what they mean by that. Do you think they know?
I don't think they do. I mean, Islamophobia is a complete nonsense. I mean, it's an idea that was cooked up by Islamists and very well propounded and taken up by a lot of idiots in kind of Western liberal elite circles. It's basically a demand that you cannot criticise a particular religion.
Right.
We all recognise kind of anti-Muslim bigotry when you see it, when someone is, you know, having broadsides against, making generalisations, demonising people on the basis of their faith or whatever. But that's not what Islamophobia is about. It's trying to chill, demonise and ultimately silence criticism of a religion, which, as I say, is what freedom of speech historically was built on.
Exactly. I mean, wouldn't it be less Islamophobic to treat our Muslim co-citizens as equals to ourselves, and to say that in a secular society we all get to be criticised and we all get to be ridiculed, and we're not going to treat you any differently, we're not going to patronise you in this way? Wouldn't that be the more progressive approach?
I completely agree, but a lot of the so-called progressives don't seem to see it that way. But it's exactly right. We're essentially treating our British Muslim fellow citizens as essentially kind of overgrown violent children. And we are also taking the extremist violent fringe and suggesting that they are essentially the authentic voice of British Muslims who we have to listen to and capitulate to. It completely throws liberal Muslims under the bus. It completely throws smaller Muslim sects under the bus. I mean, if you think about the only individual over the last 10 or 15 years who's actually been killed in this country as a result of blasphemy, it was an Ahmadi Muslim who lived in Glasgow, because of the fact that the Ahmadis by certain other sections of the Muslim population are considered to be heretics and instead considered to be blasphemers. So when you allow these kind of blasphemy restrictions or this general intolerance against so-called blasphemers to take hold in your society, it's also a really big threat to the minorities within the minority within Islam, which is why I think we should take no truck with this idea that these extremists speak for all Muslims in this country or anywhere else.
Tom Slater, thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you.